Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 18th of March of 2024. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about the borderlands, regarding the end of the president elections and regarding the complete disaster at Ukraine attempts to cross the border and attack Russian positions. Today we see that the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation made a decision to continue using Belgorod direction as a separate direction. According to the Russians, the total losses of the Ukrainians in Belgorod direction today were around 150 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system. And main losses the Ukrainians had on their side of the border, but not on the Russian one. During the day, the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking Belgorod, and the most terrible part is that Ukrainians were using cluster rounds, cluster missiles, and there were casualties among civilians. According to information we have, the Russians, as a result of, let's say, Ukrainian strikes with cluster rounds, up to 11 people died, around 80 people were wounded and were in hospital, and 9 of them were in a very difficult condition. So for now we don't know for sure what is going to be next with them. According to information we have, the Russians managed to destroy 17 Vampires multi-launch rocket system just during the previous 24 hours from the Ukrainian side. The Russians continue the hunting, and as you can see, the clashes in the area are going to continue. When talking about the situation on the ground, common situation on the ground, of course, the most important piece of news is that Ukrainians made a decision to completely evacuate civilians from the borderlands between Belgorod area and Kupinsk direction. There were the list of 55 settlements were published, and according to them, the Ukrainians will start forced evacuation. During the previous year in August, they have already announced evacuation, but that was like evacuation if you want, and now they're going to be forced evacuation. And obviously the Ukrainians will try to, let's say, to take the empty houses, buildings, and to create some trenches and fortifications area from them, which also confirms that very soon the Russians are going to start offensive operation. But from the other side, we got additional report from Sumy area, and according to the sources on the ground, the Russians are going to start offensive operation in this direction as well, and the Ukrainians also have announced the evacuation from this area. We still haven't received even a single document confirming this evacuation, but sources on the ground start spreading these, let's say, rumors and talks that in a day or two, in a week, the Ukrainian authorities, local authorities, will announce about evacuation from this direction. When talking about the situation on the ground, the clashes continue on the border, but for example, when talking Kursk direction, there is just, let's say, artillery strikes exchange. On this video, for example, we can see how the Ukrainians, to be more precise, the proxy Ukrainian forces managed to discover the Russian ammo depot in Tetkina, and as a result of artillery strike, that ammo depot first was damaged, and then there was a secondary detonation, and after the secondary detonation, the entire ammo depot was destroyed. Very likely that there were no ammo, that was maybe something like a storage of some material that can be burned very easily, and the Ukrainians basically destroyed that storage. Who knows? From the other side, we see attacks from the Russian side towards Ryzhivka. The Russians managed to discover a few Ukrainian command centers, few Ukrainian positions in the area, and as a result of FAB strikes, the Russians destroyed ammo depots. The Russians attacked the area with FPV drones. On this video, we can see the movements of proxy Ukrainian forces among the buildings from one position to another. When they were discovered, the Russians sent FPV drone, and the FPV drone complete the job, and the building was reduced to ruins. Anyway, we see just exchange of strikes without any progress and movements on the ground. And the same story we received from Graivarun area. No activity on the ground, no clashes. As you can see, there is no even how to say, let's say, icons of FPV drone strikes or artillery strikes regarding the level of loss according to the Ministry of Defense. The only report we have is that over the past week, the Russians used more than 200 FAB aerial bombs with UMPC module in this area in Sumy region, and of this, about 100 aerial bombs were fired at the village of Velika Pisarivka. This is the village of Velika Pisarivka, the area of main concentration concentration of Ukrainian forces that the Ukrainians were using to attack Graivarun area. If you remember, yesterday we discussed the area with flag that Ukrainians established this settlement, and today the Russians published the video how they managed to completely restore control in this territory. So once again, if we summarize everything, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation continue using Belgorod direction, the separate direction, which means something. Obviously, the losses on this direction are very heavy, heavier than on Kupiansk direction, for example, to compare. Very likely the Russians are going to start offensive operation very soon, not just because of just a vital question for the Russians to reduce the pressure on the Russian region, but from the other side, we understand that the front line from Kupiansk to Zaporozhye was more or less stable. We can see the movements, but the movements are very slow and very low. So that's why if the Russians want to refresh the situation, they need to open the second front line where the Ukrainians are not ready, where the Ukrainians don't expect the Russian strike. Now we're moving to the front lines, Kupiansk northern direction. We haven't received anything. We haven't received any confirmation of Russian success of, let's say, yesterday's offensive operations towards Kotlarovka. We haven't received anything from Terny direction. The Russians are getting closer and closer to village, but yet no geolocations, no reports confirming the clashes on the inside of the village. But the Russians are getting closer. The most let's say, active area today during the previous 24 hours was Siversk direction. We got a lot of updates, so let's discuss them. The most interesting details are coming from Siversk itself. On this video, for example, we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking the capital of the area, Siversk region, with FABs, with multiple launch rocket systems, with different types of weapon. So the Russians were pretty focused in the area, and the main reason of this focus is the Bilogorovka offensive operation. Bilogorovka is a very big problem for the Russians. For example, on this video we can see the area of Bilogorovka, and we see the use of Russian aerial bomb with cluster rounds, RBK 500. If we go back to forest, to the map, we're going to find these strikes, these explosions took place in this part of the forest to the south of Bilogorovka. And as you can see, the Russians were pretty focused on the area. We have lots of geolocations. Let's take a look at this once again. This is the forest. This is the strikes and explosions of RBK 500. Later, after the RBK 500 arrived, the Russians started bombing the territory with TOS flamethrower systems. This is it. This is the strikes of TOS flamethrower systems, and all these videos confirms just one thing: very big focus of the Russian forces in the area, and the use of heavy weapon. And all these things tell us that very soon the Russians are planning to start offensive operation. And the main reason of possible Russian offensive operation is that the Russians stuck at Bilogorovka, and during the previous attempts to capture the village, all of those attempts were repelled by the Ukrainians and having significant losses. The Russians always were forced to fall back. During the day, the Russians were bombing the village from the within the multiple launch rocket systems. Bilogorovka is a very big problem for the Russians. I just remind you that in 2022, after the end of Lysychansk and battle for Severodonetsk-Lysychansk, the Russians managed to establish control over the village. Furthermore, the Russians managed to move further, and they controlled Georgievka as well. So not just Bilogorovka, but Georgievka as well were under Russian control. But later, during the autumn Ukrainian counter-offensive operation, where in Kharkiv area the Ukrainians managed to restore control not just over almost complete Kharkiv region and Liman. The Ukrainians also managed to counter-attack on Georgievka and to restore control over Georgievka and Bilogorovka. So the Ukrainians were moving in the autumn of 2022, something like this, and they restored control over Georgievka, over Bilogorovka, and also the Ukrainians restore control over Sporne, because Sporne also was under the Russians in 2022 after the end of Lysychansk agglomeration clashes. And after that, after the Ukrainians restored control, the Russians made lots of attempts with the purpose to return Bilogorovka back, but all those attempts were repelled by the Ukrainians due to the geography and due to the topographical map. There are hills. This is the hill, this is the hill, this is the forest. The Russians during the previous phases made lots of attempts to attack from the north. The Russians were attacking from the northeast. The Russians many times established control over the filtration station, but always the Ukrainians counterattack and the Russians were forced to fall back. And now the Russians, as we can see according to geolocations, are trying to attack from Zolotaryevka to the forest with the purpose to completely cut and to get as close as possible to the main supply roads that goes from Bilogorovka to Siversk, and to cut the roads and to encircle the Ukrainian forces of 81st Air Mobile Brigade and some parts of 54th Mechanized Brigade. Because without Bilogorovka there are no chances to move further to Siversk. And I'll remind you that also the Russians made a lot of attempts to attack Bilogorovka through Seversky Donetsk River, but those attacks also were repelled. So unlucky Bilogorovka for the Russians, and now we see that the Russians are trying to establish complete control and to move further to Siversk. Now we're moving to Bakhmut-Artyomovsk direction. We have some updates from geolocations from the area, and according to information we have, the Ukrainians, there are very heavy clashes in the vicinity of Klishchevka. We have additional footage of FPV drone strikes of the Russian forces against the Ukrainian positions. A little bit further to the south in the area of Andreevka, the Ukrainian sources, to be more precise, the forces of 92nd Separate Storm Assault Brigade, published the video of how they managed to repel another Russian attack. On this video, if you have access to map you can watch, we can see significant number of destroyed Russian armored vehicles. Probably some of them were destroyed during the previous attempts to attack, but that was another failed attack from the Russians, and so for now the Russians can't return control over this foothold. From the other side, we continue receiving updates from Ivanovska. As you can see, we have adjusted the map again. We have returned some streets under Ukraine control, and the most important, we have returned under control the northern and northwestern part of Ivanovska. On this video that was published just today, we're gonna see the video how the Russians were FPV droning the Ukrainians in the area, which confirms the Ukrainian control over the territory. So that's why we have returned. And an interesting report about Chasiv Yar, for the first time, probably for the previous maybe 3 or 4 months, we haven't received even a single geolocated video of Russian, let's say, FAB 500 or FAB 1500 strikes. So for some reason there was a small operational pause in the area. Maybe we just haven't received geolocations. Now we're moving to Bakhmut, to Avdiivka direction. We got a lot of updates from this area. Let's start from the south to the north. According to reliable mappers, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the farms to the west of Toninka, and the Ukrainians were forced to abandon their positions and to live to the west further in the fields. And this information was confirmed by different Russian resources. So if we turn back to map, currently this is something like the Russian control, at least in this part of Toninka. According to reports, according to different sources, right before we start making the video, we got a report that Ukrainians left completely Orlovka and Toninka, and so that's territory. This part of Toninka and this part of Orlovka are in the gray zone, and the Russians are conducting currently the clearing operation, and very likely it may be tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation will include reports that they managed to establish complete control over these 2 villages, and after that the Russians gonna have to complete the story just of Berdichi, and this is going to be the end, and then the Russians will be able to cross this defense belt. About Berdichi, according to information we have, the Russians gained additional foothold, additional, let's say, buildings in the central part of Berdichi, but still Ukrainians control the northern and the northwestern parts. We have the geolocated proofs how the Russians were bombing the territory with flamethrower systems, trying to reduce the Ukrainian activity and Ukrainian soldiers there. But very likely the most important update is coming from the northern part between Novokalinova and Krasnogorovka. For example, today the Russian military expert reported that as a result of counteroffensive conducted by the Ukrainians, they managed to, let's say, restore some positions along the railways. This is the Riber, if you watch this post, was talking about the counterattacks that we have already discussed a few days ago on the 16th of March. If you remember, we were talking that on 16th of March, the Russians published the geolocated proofs of Ukrainian movements towards the Russian positions. On this area, we can see how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainians with flamethrower systems in the area. a little bit to the southeast, we got a failed Ukrainian attempt to land infantry in the trenches and to start clearing operation. On this video we can see a group of Russians on the Russian side of the railways, and on the Ukrainian side of the railways we see the, let's say, landing operation. But something went wrong, and the Ukrainians either got under the mine fire and the entire crew was destroyed. And in this area, on the, let's say, northwestern part of the trenches along the railways, we see another movement of Ukrainians that were discovered and as a result of mortar strike were destroyed. So Ryber was talking about this, and very likely maybe we need to change the map, but for now we don't have like 100% proofs that Ukrainians managed to restore control at least over this part. But regarding the fact whether the Ukrainians managed to do this or not, this is very dangerous operations from the Ukrainian side. And the main thing is that very likely, and we need to understand that Ukrainians are not going to, let's say, counterattack in this direction with the purpose to restore control over the railways, with the purpose, let's say, to counterattack towards Krasnogorovka, to capture Krasnogorovka, or to return control over Avdiivka. The Ukrainians don't have these forces and these resources to do this, but to attack here and then to make border attacks behind the Russians in Stepovo Berdichi, this is what the Ukrainians can do. And this will take additional time to Russians to clear the area, to restore control. So basically by this counterattack, the Ukrainians just try to win some time, additional day, maybe a week, maybe a month. Anyway, the Russians will complete this. It's just a matter of time, and the Ukrainians want to increase this time the Russians require to complete the clearing of the area. Now we are moving further to the southern part, Marinka direction. During the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything, just one explosion in the area of Krasnogorovka. As a result of strike, we see very heavy explosion. Probably another command center or headquarters were destroyed without any changes on the ground. Interesting details are coming from Novomikhailivka. We see activity, let's say a semi-encircled activity of Novomikhailivka, but most of these footages were published by the Ukrainians. These are, let's say, archive footage of how the Ukrainians were repelling the Russian attacks that took place from the 10th till 18th of March, how they managed to destroy some Russian armored vehicles, repel some attacks. Anyway, nothing new in the videos, just to confirm, these videos confirm the current, let's say, line of combat contact, and that the Russians are moving further. So no changes on the ground. The same story about South Donetsk direction, to be more precise, about Velika Novoselovka. Another day in a row the Russians are bombing the tree lines and the trenches to the southeast of Orozhaina. Almost every single day we receive additional video of fabbing of the area, which confirms that very likely the Russians do have some plans for further offensive operation, but for now they are completely focused on bombing and destroying the Ukrainian positions along the trenches in the area. The Russians have almost completed the building of the railways. Today we got additional video of how the Russians are building the railways, connecting the mainland with Kherson and Zaporozhye direction. As you can see, there is a very big construction process. Very likely the Russians will complete the building this year, and after that the security question will be completely resolved for the Russians, and there are going to be no risk for the Russians to lose Crimean Bridge and something like this. Now we're moving to Zaporozhye direction, and we continue receiving lots of very interesting details and updates from the territory. And today we got another Lemur missile strike in Malinovka. As a result of strike, another temporary position of Ukrainian forces was destroyed. To understand the situation in this village, it's better to increase the numbers of updates from the 1st of January. And this map, this information will give us the approximate understanding of the Russian focus in the area. Almost every single building was damaged just this year. Imagine yourself the situation that have been taking place here, let's say, for the previous year or something like this. And furthermore, I'll remind you that just yesterday we were talking that the Russians managed to restore control, establish or restore control over the village by the name of Mirna, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, and we were suggesting and making some conclusions, projections based on that, what was the purpose of this Russian activity around Huliaipole. And today we continue receiving updates, but from the area by the name of Luganskaya Bilogoria, this area. And what we have, the Russians, for example, example, published the video of how they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces in Belagorod with FPV drones. As a result of those FPV drone bombing, the Ukrainians had losses, and significant losses, not just among the personnel but also among armored vehicles, warehouses. And this video, from one perspective, this video shows just Russian activity, but very active attacks with the use of significant number of FPV drones of so on. And today, let's say later, after this video were published, we got additional report from the Ukrainian side. On this video, for example, we can see how the Russian soldiers were evacuating wounded soldiers along the street. This is Russian soldiers with evacuated wounded, and Ukraine FPV drone attacked the Russians. So the Russians were moving something like this along Lugovskoye street towards Bagate, so along this line, and the Ukrainians attacked them with FPV drone in this area. And now, if we combine and summarize all these updates, we can make a conclusion that first, the Russians were FPV droning the Ukrainians in Belagorod, and after that the Russians conducted assault operation with the purpose to clear the area with infantry. They probably attacked and even managed to enter the village. Then there was a very heavy clashes inside of the village, and after the Russians had some losses and so on, the first group started evacuation and, let's say, rotation process, and they start evacuating the wounded, and the wounded were damaged in this area. So I'm trying to say that very likely that soon we're going to receive some updates from the territory, and we're going to have to change the map and adjust the map either in the gray zone or under complete Russian control. And once again, I'll remind you that just yesterday we received an update from the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation that as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to establish complete control over Mirne. Also, during the previous days, we got a lot of updates about the Russian attacks in this area and how they managed to maintain the gray zone here. And we have lots of strikes in Mirne. We have certain Russian activity in the vicinity of Залізничне, in the vicinity of Druzhba, in the vicinity of Huliaipole. We have certain activity here. For example, Novopokrovka, we have artillery strikes. So we can make conclusion that on this line there are very heavy clashes, and very likely the Russians are storming this area, but for now we still haven't received any reports. And if the Russians are able to capture the entire foothold, of course the Ukrainians are going to face significant problems and significant risk of controlling further Orekhov. And now we are moving to Kherson direction, where we also got a lot of interesting details, and the most interesting updates are coming from Mykolaiv. For example, for the first time, probably since the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians started publishing the video of Lancet strikes against the boats and ships in this river that connects, let's say, Mykolaiv with the Black Sea. And this is it's not strange to us because we were talking about the area. I'll remind you that Ukrainians start building the road around Mykolaiv, the second road. This is probably the Russians maybe have some plans to destroy the bridge if they're ever going to start Mykolaiv offensive operation. So that's why the Ukrainians decided to build the second bridge in the area. Also, we remember about possible Ukrainian attack and possible Ukrainian attempts to establish control over the Kinburn Spits. So that's why the Russians are really focused on destroying of Ukrainian, let's say, sea assets in the area, and we see that the Russians are pretty successful. Another ship that was destroyed as a result of Russian Lancet strike. Very interesting information, very interesting details. The Ukrainians continue building the defense belt between Odessa and Mykolaiv, and this is also a very weird update. The question is why the Ukrainians are building defense belt if they're not going to fall back from Mykolaiv. So very strange, but maybe they just want to be on the safe side and so on, but who knows what is going to be next on this direction. When talking about the global updates in global scope, the most important is that according to Putin, according to the Western sources, there are already NATO soldiers on the territory of Ukraine, and there are going to be more, obviously. And furthermore, the NATO is planning and already started building the biggest base on Romania territory that will, let's say, probably include up to 10,000 soldiers, so it's going to be the forces of fast reaction. If everything goes wrong, these forces of fast reaction will be redeployed to Odessa, and today we got some reconnaissance operation of NATO aviation in the Black Sea and along the shore, along the bank of the Black Sea. Maybe soon we're gonna see some attempts from the Western countries and NATO countries to attack Crimea with missiles and probably drones. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.